made clear, no need to fear. Stay tuned, your mind expands today. Summa Made Simple, learn in a fun way.
Welcome to another episode of Summa Made Simple. In this episode, we shall be continuing with our exploration of the virtue of fortitude through the different questions and answers that St. Thomas Aquinas asks about the virtue of fortitude in the book Summa Theologica. Every time I come across a question and an answer, I always ask myself, what is the relevance of this to the man on the street? And when I cannot find an answer to that question, I move on and I keep going and going until I stumble upon something which when I read it, I think to myself, wow, okay, I think this has relevance to the man on the street. And in this episode, we shall be looking at the 8th article in St. Thomas's discussion on fortitude, which poses the question whether the brave man delights in his act. And through its answering this question, what St. Thomas does is he explores the topic of whether carrying out deeds of virtue feels good or not. Is it going to make us feel fantastic inside or not? And I think the relevance of this for the man on the street is precisely because there's this prevailing notion that, if I try to lead a good life, be a spiritual person, practice integrity, go to church, give money to the poor, I'm gonna feel good inside. It's gonna be really great. Well, maybe that might not just be the case. And the reason this is important to discuss and to go through is for the sake of managing expectations. I know very many people who, not very many, I know a good number, of people who sort of make the decision to take the life of virtue more seriously. From now on, I'm going to try really hard to be a better person. I'm going to try really hard to do the right thing in every circumstance, in every situation. And then I'm going to try really hard to pray and etc. Then they start along the path and then after a while they stop. And you ask them like, what happened? I don't see you trying anymore. And, after a while you dig a little bit and you realize that it didn't feel good anymore. They went through a state of desolation. And to be forewarned is to be forearmed. And this point is important because it sort of forewarns it forewarns us that we should not have a false expectation that practicing virtue is going to make us feel fantastic. No, it's not. Let's get into the point. Whether the brave man delights in his act, he starts by listing the objections. I won't go through all of them except the second one, which I think is particularly relevant to the angle which we're taking that makes this useful for the man on the street. Objection 2. Furthermore, St. Ambrose, commenting on Galatians verse 22, says, "But the fruit of the Spirit is charity, joy, peace," says that deeds of virtue are called fruits because they refresh man's mind with a holy and pure delight. Now, the brave man performs acts of virtue. Therefore, he takes pleasure in his act. Let's unpack that a little bit. In the letter to the Galatians, St. Paul lists the fruits of the Spirit. He says the fruits of the Spirit is charity, joy, peace, etc. And then St. Ambrose says these things are called fruits because they refresh man's mind with a holy and pure delight. Basically, acts of virtue refresh man's mind with a holy and pure delight. Now, the brave man performs acts of virtue, therefore, he takes pleasure in his act. That is a powerful, powerful objection. One of the things I really enjoy about St. Thomas is when he puts forth objections, many times he uses scripture. So it's like he's using scripture to rebut scripture or to put forward his points, which is powerful. It reminds me of Christ's temptations in the desert when the devil came at him, the second temptation, and actually, used scripture to try and tempt him. Going into St. Thomas's answer, St. Thomas says, on the contrary, the brave man, so I quotes Aristotle. He says, on the contrary, the philosopher says that the brave man seems to have no delight in his act. And then now he gives his take. I answer that, as stated above in a previous question, when we are dealing with the passions or the emotions, pleasure is of two kinds. One is physical in the body, resulting from bodily contact, and the other is spiritual in the soul, resulting from an apprehension of the soul or something that the soul realizes or understands or knows. It is the latter, the apprehension of the soul, which properly results from deeds of virtue, since in them we consider the good of reason. In brief sentences, he packs in a lot of ideas, and he keeps repeating things that virtue has to do with the good of reason. Reason resides within the soul, and therefore virtue has to do with the good of the soul. Now, the principal act of, carrying on with the point, now the principal act of fortitude is to endure. Remember, we spoke about this in episode 1. Now, the principal act of fortitude is to endure not only certain things that are unpleasant as apprehended or as recognized by the soul, for instance, the loss of bodily life, which the virtuous man loves not only as a natural good, but also as being necessary for acts of virtue and things connected to them. In other words, you cannot perform acts of virtue without your body. So for instance, you cannot give money to the poor if you don't have a body with which to give money to the poor. And so that's one of the reasons why a person, if they want to practice virtue, would be sad when they think of the loss of their body with which they needed to practice virtue. Also, the body is necessary for acts of virtue and things connected with them, but also to endure things unpleasant in respect to bodily contact, such as wounds and blows. Sorry, I've lost myself there because this sentence is very long. This sentence is super long. Let me read it in one go, try and unpack it. Now, the principal act of fortitude is to endure not only certain things that are unpleasant as apprehended by the soul, for instance, the loss of bodily life, but also to endure things unpleasant in respect to bodily contact, such as wounds and blows. Okay, I get it now. Basically, he's saying, that sentence has multiple clauses, but there are two main clauses there to understand it. Now, the principal act of fortitude is to endure. We've spoken about that before. To endure not only things that are unpleasant to the soul, but to endure things which are unpleasant to the body. And the reason we have to endure things unpleasant to the soul, the things which make things unpleasant to the soul, is when we realize that the soul will no longer be able to perform good acts when it loses certain things, such as the body. Hence, the brave man, on one side, has something that affords him delight, namely as regards spiritual pleasure, in the act itself of virtue and the end thereof, while on the other hand, he has cause for both spiritual sorrow in the thought of losing his life and for bodily pain. Hence we read in 2 Maccabees that Eliezer said, I suffer grievous pains in body, but in soul I am well content to suffer these things because I fear thee. I am not exactly sure how to explain that, but let's carry on, and that probably the next paragraph will shed light on the previous, what he's just said. Now, the sensible pain of the body makes one insensible to the spiritual delight of virtue. Now this is the meat and potatoes of this point. Now, the sensible pain of the body, in other words, the physical pain that we experience, makes one insensible to the spiritual delight of virtue. In other words, when we experience physical pain, it makes it very difficult for us to enjoy the spiritual pleasure of carrying out acts of virtue. But here's the point. Without the copious assistance of God's grace, which has more strength to raise the soul to the divine things in which it delights than bodily pains have to afflict it. Put simply, many times, when we carry out acts of virtue, we're supposed to experience delight and pleasure. However, if they're accompanied by physical pain, that physical pain makes it sort of deletes that spiritual pleasure that we'd have experienced, except unless we have a huge amount of grace from God to enjoy spiritual pleasure for carrying out acts of virtue, despite experiencing physical pain because of carrying out those acts of virtue. I think that makes sense. Basically, God is the hinge on which this whole situation turns. And then he gives an example of a martyr. Thus, the blessed Tibertius, while walking barefoot on the burning coal, said that he felt as though he were walking on roses. Yet, the virtue of fortitude prevents the reason from being entirely overcome by bodily pain. In other words, he says that when we experience bodily pain can make us turn away from the good of reason. It can make us turn away from doing good things. However, the virtue of fortitude sort of prevents that turning away. That's part of the definition. That's part of the job of the virtue of fortitude. You see something good, you realize this is going to be very painful, maybe so painful even to the point of death, but you still do it because it's good. That's called fortitude. And the delight of virtue overcomes spiritual sorrow, inasmuch as a man prefers the good of virtue to the life of the body and to whatever appertains thereto. So again, he says you've got delight of virtue on one side, you've got spiritual sorrow on the other side. Spiritual sorrow, he said, is caused by the soul understanding that it's going to lose so many things that will allow it to carry out virtue. We spoke about this a few minutes earlier. Then he says the delight of virtue outweighs the sorrow that we feel for carrying out those good deeds which will result in some way, shape, or form of loss of bodily life. Hence, the philosopher says that it is not necessary for a brave man to delight so as to perceive his delight, but it suffices for him not to be sad. Okay, don't fully understand that, but we'll carry on. Now, moving on to reply to objection 2. You remember objection 2 was the one where St. Ambrose, commenting on Galatians, said the fruits of the Spirit are charity, joy, peace, etc. And these are called fruits because they refresh man's mind with a holy and pure delight. Now, the brave man performs acts of virtue, therefore he takes pleasure in his act. Remember, right at the beginning, we said this is the most relevant objection to the man on the street at the moment who thinks that if he does good deeds, it's going to feel good. The reply to that objection is deeds of virtue are delightful mainly on account of their end, their goal, which is a good. Yet they can be painful by their nature. And this is principally the case with fortitude. Hence, the philosopher says that to perform deeds with pleasure does not happen in all virtues except insofar as one attains the end. What's the relevance of this? The relevance of this, as I said earlier, is to manage expectations. I wanted, St. Josemaria, the founder of Opus Dei, once said that when people come to Opus Dei, when people make a decision to very decisively practice or make an effort to lead a good life, practice integrity, try and practice the virtues, he said, tell them that they're coming not to the mountain of the transfiguration, but to the mountain of the crucifixion. You remember the transfiguration and the crucifixion both happened on mountains. The Mount of the Transfiguration was fantastic. I mean, the apostles were having a fantastic time seeing Jesus bathed in light, and they said, whoa, let's stay here forever. Let's make 3 tents. Let's one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. Let's just stay here and not go down the mountain. It's so fantastic. Mount Calvary was the opposite experience. I mean, they just ran away. No one wanted to stick around, basically, right? It was terrible. And the founder of Opus Dei said, when people come to Opus Dei and they're trying to live a life of virtue and trying to practice a life of integrity and aiming to become good people, it's not going to be fun. It's not going to be fun. It's actually going to be a lot of pain and suffering. So it's just a thing of managing expectations. Like if you make that decision to try and practice a life of virtue, do not expect it to be a walk in the park. Do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that you're going to experience because everyone experiences it also. Manage expectations. But keep in mind that the way the story ends is good, which is what the philosopher says, Aristotle says, to perform deeds with pleasure does not happen in all virtues except insofar as one attains the end. By an extension, you could apply this to the resurrection and the crucifixion. You see, at the end of the crucifixion, that's not where the story ends. The story ends with the resurrection and the ascension. So even when a person practices virtue and goes through moments of sadness, of grief, of sorrow, and I think this is one of the interpretations of that beatitude, blessed is he who mourns, for he shall be comforted. I don't think it refers to, when you lose a loved one and then you feel terrible, you suffer grief. I think it refers more to this. This is the commentary I've come across, which to me makes a lot of sense. When a person breaks away from a certain lifestyle, which was a lifestyle of vice, which was a lifestyle of sin, which was a lifestyle of evil. Let's say a person says, from now on, I'm not going to watch pornography, I'm not going to drink alcohol, I'm not going to gamble, whatever. Do not think that now you're going to feel good. You're going to feel terrible. You're going to feel terrible. And that will be a cause of mourning, of grieving. I'm not going to hang out with certain friends because they drag me down. They cause me to be a worse version of myself. I'm deleting their numbers, or if they ever call me, I'll never and invite me to hang out with them, I won't. You're going to go through a period of grief and mourning for that. And then there's also the grief and mourning. This is another interpretation I've heard of this verse of of your previous sins, of the life that you had before. You'll also go through a period of grief and mourning. So mourning on 2 counts. But even though you experience that desolation, even though you experience that Calvary, that crucifixion, the story doesn't end there. As the philosopher says, except insofar as one that performed deeds with pleasure does not happen in all virtues, except insofar as one attains the end. The pleasure comes right at the end with the resurrection and the ascension. That's where the consolation comes. So the story does not end in tragedy. It has a very happily ever after.